We've seen some reports, including one statement by the IDF in the last hour about some of the response that you've had to take from Hezbollah in reaction to this, including projectiles fired as far as central Israel. Can you tell us more about that, and have there been any casualties your side?
I'm aware of one civilian that was injured in a rocket attack that indeed originate from Lebanon, launched by Hezbollah. The sirens sounded here earlier on today, indeed in central Israel as well, but there is bombardment being launched by Hezbollah, as they have been doing for almost a year now, since October 8th. So it's not new. The only thing that is actually new in this morning is the fact that we're on the offensive, taking the fight to Hezbollah, their positions, the locations where they've positioned themselves ready to invade Israel, like what happened in October 7th. So that's what we are currently doing. Indeed, they are responding, and it's not unexpected. I can tell you that in the last hour, we've also updated the instructions in the home front, restricting mass gatherings of Israelis in public spaces so that they are safer and they're more aware. It's not something completely new, but this afternoon we needed to highlight the dangers of the war that is developing.
Is that because you are expecting a much bigger response from Hezbollah? Are you prepared for one?
I think hope is not a method. We need the civilians to adhere to our call to act with caution. Gatherings, we can't hope that they don't launch rockets. We know that they'll be doing that. They have been doing that for a year, and even more so with cruise missiles, precision-guided missiles, and these are the types of tools that they've accumulated over the last 20 years. So from our perspective, we want the Israelis, we want the civilians to be protected. We want them to understand that their situation is shifting. And indeed, we want them to make sure that they can take cover and not put unnecessary people at unnecessary risk.
You've announced that your incursion into Lebanon will be limited, targeted and localized. How are you going to ensure that that is the case?
I think it's important to add on those three words a very important context of the border area. That is where we're currently operating. That is what we are afraid of. We are concerned of the infrastructure, the attack infrastructure that Hezbollah has established across the frontier from east to west. So we are currently operating in order to negate, destroy, and dismantle that infrastructure that has been that they've built over the last years. Now, that infrastructure, when I'm talking about, I think to make it into much more simple and tangible terms, it's staging grounds. It's places where the Hezbollah terrorists from the Radwan force, which is their special forces, which are highly equipped, which have been trained by Iran, gather, arm themselves. They go into a house, go into a tunnel, and then run in a tunnel and go to close proximity in order to breach into the border, into the communities. I think sometimes we forget that and perhaps even issues and incidents that got lost in the news of October 7th, the October 7th attack. But in the first month of the war, between October and November, we had 7 instances of infiltration attacks from Lebanon into Israel. So it's not something that's just abstract. It's a plan that they had. They devised a plan. They called their plan the plan to conquer the Galilee. And indeed, their forces had trained for this eventuality. Even so much so, in 2015, they publicized their plan of action of storming the border, of bombarding Israel, and conducting attacks and atrocities against Israelis living in northern Israel.
I guess a different way of asking the same question. I'm sure you acknowledge that even if Israel's actions in Gaza have been for very clear military aims, and even if all are fully justified, that it has come at an extraordinarily high human cost. Are you confident that there won't be a similar trade-off in southern Lebanon?
I certainly hope not. The situation is completely different, and the war goals are completely different. There are similarities. The fact that Hezbollah, by design, not by mistake, positioned all of its cruise missiles, for instance, in the heart of the southern neighborhood of Beirut is reason for concern. Those cruise capabilities can hit probably most locations in central and northern Israel. So those are legitimate targets. They need to be taken out. We operate under the understanding that we operate within the framework of the laws of armed conflict, indeed proportionality, and distinction between the terrorists where they're holding out. And indeed, every civilian death in this conflict is a result of how Hezbollah has positioned itself, how they have conducted their infrastructure precisely and intentionally as a strategy.
You said that the aim is slightly different, and I think by that you're saying it's not to completely destroy Hezbollah in the same way that it was for Hamas in Gaza. On reflection, given the civilian cost, was the aim wrong in Gaza? Was the execution wrong?
I think Hamas in Gaza turned Gaza, the entire Gaza Strip, into a staging ground to launch attacks like the atrocities of 7th of October. And now if we reflect on that in the last year, of course, that government could not have been permitted to build those capabilities and conduct that a terrible day in the history of our nation. So I would say, no, Hamas have to go. There has to be a clear outcome of what happens on the day after. But Hamas cannot be allowed to have that power. They can't be allowed to build that terrorist capability ever again. And when we reflect between Hamas in the south and we understand that Hezbollah is probably 10 times stronger than Hamas, that is reason for concern. And that is basically why we are mobilized now. I think we need to keep in mind that over the last year, Israel has chosen the path of negotiations, a path of trying to come to a decent resolution to bring the 60,000 Israelis home that have been evacuated for a year through negotiations, through a dialogue. But unfortunately, that was not realized, and the government instructed the IDF through military force to create the conditions for these 60,000 Israelis to go home.
Let's talk about the state of your forces. It's understood that reservists are being called up for this. Does that mean there is a limited time that you hope or expect this incursion into southern Lebanon to last? If I understand things correctly, reservists can only serve for a maximum of 3 months?
No, when we're in a state of emergency, reservists like myself can serve extensively. I served in the beginning of this war for 8 months, every single day throughout the course of that. I was released and then I was brought back in. So in a state of emergency, of course, we need to rally around the troops. Of course, we need to take into considerations that it is a burden on Israeli society, on the economy. And so when recruiting reservists, it's as a last resort, but as a last resort in operations that need to be conducted.
How far into Lebanon do you plan to go? There were some reports that people needed to be evacuated north of the Litani River, as far as the Awami River. Have you heard of that? Is that something that you would advise people in Lebanon to do, or is there no need because of the more localized, targeted incursion that you're describing?
So the explicit instructions of evacuation have taken place in and around the border area, primarily. Of course, people in the south, there is a challenge there and a threat there because that is I would say, the hotbed and the stronghold of Hezbollah. That is where they are most traditionally stronger, and they have been building their capabilities specifically there, but not only there, in other places, also in Beirut and also in eastern Lebanon as well. So I would say that the reality in the south is one where, and I remind you that in the aftermath of the 2006 war, that ended with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that dictated that there should be no weapons in the south, that Hezbollah should not have these tools of terror. And if that would have been implemented, there would be no need for us to be at war now.
Let's touch on the 2006 war, which clearly was not particularly successful. Why will this time be different? And again, with the context of trying to minimize the civilian casualties that we discussed earlier, is it going to be one or the other?
I think that the idea of operating against a terrorist organization that is deeply embedded within civilian locations is a huge challenge. I think there are very distinct differences between 2006 and today. The war goals today is to bring home and to permit safe and secure return of 60,000 Israelis that have been demanding to go home now for a year, but they want to go home in safety and security. Those can be achieved through military operations or through negotiations. And I think we're listening to our allies as well that are also voicing that. I think these, as you opened with, I think that when we look at the conditions that are currently on the ground, There was no way that Hezbollah was going to stop firing rockets, stop launching attacks against the communities of Metula, the town of Kiryat Shmona. All of these places now are ghost towns precisely because of what Hezbollah has done. That's an unacceptable reality, rightly by the civilians that are demanding to go home. And therefore, we are now on this offensive. And perhaps on a last note on that, the reality that was created in 2006 was similar to what happened in October of last year, on the 7th of October. It was a surprise attack by a terrorist organization catching us off guard. I think the offensive that we've conducted in the last week or so, decapitating Hezbollah's leadership, undermining and infringing and impeding on their operational commanders to conduct attacks against us, seeking them out and hunting them down, and at the same time destroying their strategic assets, the long-range missiles, the surface-to-surface guided missiles, the precision capabilities. All of this come together means that we can create a much better, secure future for Israelis and Lebanese alike.
Peter Lerner, thank you for joining us.